Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. My guest today is Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary-General. He joins us from NATO headquarters in Brussels. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Mr. Stoltenberg, in 3 weeks, NATO will hold a summit, and many fear that there will be a reprisal of the G7 summit with the US President Donald Trump going after his allies for not paying enough for their own defense. Are you concerned that the NATO summit could see something similar?
I'm absolutely confident that the NATO summit could demonstrate actually transatlantic unity, that Europe and North America stand together. I admit that there are differences now on important and serious issues like, for instance, trade, the Paris Climate Accord or the Iran nuclear deal. But what we have seen before and what we actually see today is that despite those differences, NATO is able to deliver on our core responsibility, security, defense. We see that the US is actually stepping up their presence in Europe, and at the same time European allies are also doing more. So when it comes to defense and security, we actually see that the transatlantic bond is not weakened, but actually strengthened.
But we've seen Donald Trump, especially in sense that Germany, for not spending enough on defense. I mean, there are also complaints about trade imbalance, and now, most recently, about immigration. Are you concerned that Mr. Trump will use that opportunity to berate the allies and, or maybe even not show up in Brussels?
Well, I met President Trump recently in the White House, and he reconfirmed his strong personal commitment to NATO, to the transatlantic defense and security cooperation. And he also recognizes that European allies are investing more in defense. Of course, he has a strong message about the need to do more, and I agree with him, and also European allies agree with him, because all European allies and the United States and Canada agreed back in 2014 to invest more in defense. We didn't promise to spend 2% of GDP on defense within a year. What we decided was to stop the cuts, gradual increase, and then move towards spending 2% of GDP on defense within a decade. And that's exactly what we are doing. All allies have stopped the cuts. All allies have started to increase, and more allies spend now 2% of GDP on defense. So also Germany, as other European allies, are now moving in the right direction. We have turned the corner, but we still have a long way to go.
Right, and especially Germany, obviously. I want to go to what the US Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, told military graduates last week. He said, quote unquote, Vladimir Putin seeks to shatter NATO. What's your reaction to the US Defense Secretary's declarations?
Well, we have seen that Russia tries to divide us, and Russia tries to meddle in our democratic domestic processes. And that's also one of the reasons why NATO has to be able to respond and adapt to a more assertive Russia. We are doing so partly by increasing our military presence in the eastern part of the alliance, sending a clear message to any adversary that NATO is there to protect all allies against any threat. And the whole idea of NATO is that it's based on the principle one for all and all for one. And as long as we deliver credible deterrence, we prevent military conflict. Strong military is not to provoke a conflict, but it's to prevent the conflict.
But Russia says that all your plans are a threat to your stability. What is your response to Russia saying this?
NATO is a defensive alliance. NATO's response has been proportionate, and no one thought about deploying forces to the eastern part of the alliance before Crimea, before Russia illegally annexed Crimea and started to destabilize eastern Ukraine. So there can be no doubt that we have acted in a defensive way.
I want to get to reports saying that Russia significantly, apparently, modernized a nuclear weapons storage bunker in the enclave of Kaliningrad, which is Russian territory between Poland and the Baltics. Are you concerned about what is happening there?
So I will not comment on specific intelligence, but what we have seen over several years is that Russia has invested heavily in new modern military capabilities, including nuclear. They're also exercising more conventional and nuclear operations together, and thereby reducing the threshold for the potential use of nuclear weapons. And again, this is a reason why NATO has responded by increasing our presence in the Baltic region, Poland and the Baltic countries, to send this clear message that if any ally is attacked, the whole alliance will respond. And the reason to do so is to prevent the conflict, not to provoke a conflict.
But clearly, some countries neighboring Russia are getting jittery, including Norway, your country. I mean, you've seen Norway ask 700 US Marines to train on its soil next year, close to the Russian border. Again, Russia said this was clearly unfriendly, quote unquote. Is there a concern that indeed some are talking about a Cold War, but actually we might be headed for a real war?
We don't see any imminent threat against any NATO ally. But one of the reasons why we don't see that is that NATO is there. NATO is credible. We have a strong collective defense. We have credible deterrence. That has helped to preserve the peace for almost 70 years, and that will continue to preserve the peace in Europe as long as we stand united and have credible deterrence. At the same time, I think it's important to say that NATO, we don't want a new Cold War. We don't want a new arms race. And we strive for a better relationship with Russia. Therefore, we combine what we call deterrence, defense, and dialogue. That's our dual-track approach to Russia. And as a Norwegian politician, I know that it is possible to talk to Russia. We have worked with Russia up in the high north for decades. And Russia is our biggest neighbor. It's there to stay. And we need to try to improve the relationship with Russia through political dialogue.
Right. Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko is supposed to attend the NATO summit. Do you expect to make further steps towards admitting Ukraine or other candidates to NATO at that summit?
I expect to convey a very strong message to Ukraine that we will continue to provide political and practical support for Ukraine. We will also work with another partner country like Georgia, conveying strong support for them, also provide political practical support. Hopefully we can make progress, especially when it comes to the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, because they have now reached an agreement with Greece on the name issue. And if this agreement is finalized and fully implemented, the new name will be the Republic of North Macedonia. Then we can move on when it comes to membership for the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. And I really hope that we can do so.
Is there a time frame for that?
Depends a bit on when they're able to finalize the agreement in Skopje, but hopefully we can start accession talks at the summit, at least make decision to start them at the summit in July, NATO summit in July, if everything move on as planned when it comes to ratification and also referendum in Skopje or later on this year.
Okay. Briefly, I want to get to the situation in the Mediterranean. Italy's new government has asked NATO for help to deal with immigration from North Africa, especially from Libya, saying, quote unquote, it was under attack from the south. What is your response?
NATO has a role to play in dealing with the migrant and refugee crisis because we are partly addressing the core reasons for the migrant and refugee crisis, meaning the instability in Iraq, Afghanistan, but also working with other partner countries in the region to help them stabilize their own countries. And then we are addressing the core reasons why we have a migrant and refugee crisis. in the Mediterranean,
right.
or also in the countries bordering North Africa and the Middle East. But second, we are also helping to implement the deal between Turkey and EU in the Aegean Sea. We have a naval presence there. And we also provide support to Operation Sophia, the EU naval presence in the Mediterranean. We have 10 ships currently operating in the Mediterranean, providing this kind of support. So NATO is not the only answer to the migrant and refugee crisis, but we play a part, and we have also started to look into what more we can do, especially with more training, for instance, to Iraq, so they can help make sure that ISIS is not coming back in Iraq.
Right, but you would disagree with the notion that Italy is quote-unquote under attack and that NATO should intervene as such, correct?
It's not a Article 5 or what we call a collective defense situation in the Mediterranean today, but it is a serious migrant and refugee crisis. We need many different tools to deal with that. Many of them are non-military. It's border control. It's humanitarian. It's economic issues in North Africa and the Middle East. So there are many measures, many tools we need to use to deal with this refugee and migrant crisis. But NATO has a role to play. We address the root causes, the instability in the region. We help to stabilize countries in the region, in the wider Middle East region, North Africa. And then we also help to implement the EU efforts in the Mediterranean by providing support both to Operation Sophia, but also in the Aegean Sea.
Okay, Jens Stoltenberg, that's all we have time for. Thank you very much for being with us from the NATO headquarters in Brussels. And thank you for watching this interview here on France 24.